Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, almost 250,000 people across Britain are experiencing the worst forms of homelessness. The charity Crisis has predicted that by 2026, 16,000 people will be sleeping rough. That's a rise of 76%. At any one point last year, an estimated 236,000 people were experiencing a form of homelessness in Britain. 50,000 of those would have been children. And the charity has warned that the most acute forms of homelessness will continue to climb if the state does not take long-term action to tackle it. Well, let's speak now to Paul Noblett, who's the head of public affairs at Centrepoint, a charity which helps those who are homeless. And a very good afternoon to you. There are people, predominantly Labour politicians and opposition politicians, the Lib Dems as well, who've come out and said that this is a national scandal. Would you agree?
It is, and it's a problem that's been building really since the recession of 2008. So it's really, I think, incumbent upon MPs of all sides in the House of Commons to really take a big look at this. Certainly at Centrepoint, where we support 16 to 25-year-olds, this really chimes in, this report, with the figures we've seen over recent years. Just in London alone, for example, we've seen the number of under 25 rough sleeping double in the last 10 years. So it is a really big problem, and it is really time for concerted action rather than just talk. When
we consider what a wealthy country we are, why is this happening at all, and why is it getting worse?
Well, there's some underlying issues. I mean, certainly 70% or so of the young people we support, they come to us because they've had a breakdown in the relationship with their family. So it's maybe a bit different to some of the people the public might think about in terms of those they may see rough sleeping most often. But that family breakdown can be for a number of reasons. It could be there's long-term unemployment in that family. It can be drug and alcohol abuse in that family. But it can also be some other financial pressures. It can be the many changes to benefits, which frankly have just now gone too far, and families are struggling to pay their rent. Individuals and young people are struggling to pay their rents. But we're also seeing, again, there's still problems with long-term youth unemployment, again, making it more difficult for young people to put a roof over their heads. So it's kind of a multifaceted problem, and I think the government need to look not just at rough sleeping, but also at all those young people who find themselves sofa surfing and staying with friends for a short period of time before then maybe going back out onto the streets. And we have to really be honest about the scale of the task ahead, and I think this report's very useful in highlighting it and hopefully putting it up the political agenda.
I mean, the government being criticised for not doing enough. They have introduced the Homelessness Reduction Act this year. Has that made any difference?
It's something I think we'll only really start to see over the next 12 months. Certainly in Wales, where a similar act came in a couple of years ago, they have seen it help a bit. But in the great many cases, there are still a lot of young people who will be turning up at the local councils, turning up at charities at Centrepoint, who won't get help through that new law either. So there's still a really, really long way to go, and we're just going to see more and more, I think, young people sleeping rough and sofa surfing until the government does really commit to every government department looking at this, whether it's the Department of Health, people looking after care leavers, many of whom go on to become rough sleepers, as well as just those people we more normally think about as we see rough sleeping on the streets.
And Crisis saying that the government needs to take long-term action. Is the implication then that this Homelessness Reduction Act isn't looking at the longer term enough?
I think it's a good start. I think the major problem is it might not have enough money behind it from the government to actually make it truly effective, but time will tell. I think the biggest thing it can do, the government, when it comes back in September after the summer recess, it's currently consulting on the future of supported accommodation for young people and for adults who find themselves in need of somewhere to stay. That at the moment looks like it could be an exercise more in cutting back costs and making sure people get the support they need. And I think it would send a major statement if the government to say, actually, no, this is about getting people the support they need, and we really will commit the funding this time rather than maybe just looking for quick fixes which sound good in the headlines.
OK, Paul Noblett, Head of Public Affairs at Centrepoint. Really good to talk to you this afternoon. Thank you.
250,000 people across Britain are experiencing the worst forms of homelessness. The charity Crisis has predicted that by 2026, 16,000 people will be sleeping rough. That's a rise of 76%. Now, at any one point last year, an estimated 236,000 people were experiencing a form of homelessness in Britain. 50,000 of those would have been children. The charity has warned that the most acute forms of homelessness will continue to climb if the state does not take long-term action to tackle it. Well, joining me now from Westminster is Bob Blackman, Conservative MP for Harrow East, whose private member's bill became law as the 2017 Homeless Reduction Act. Thanks ever so much for joining us this afternoon. Why exactly are these figures going up so quickly?
Well, clearly there's a lot of pressure on households. Household income is obviously under pressure. The reality is that people become homeless for various reasons, either because a private sector rental comes to an end, the tenancy comes to an end, relationship breakdown, people become unemployed, they have accidents and can no longer work, or there may be people fleeing domestic violence. So there's various different reasons why people become homeless. And one of the reasons why I took up this cause over a year ago was that we saw an increase in the number of people being visibly homeless. I mean, the figures you talk about now are the people sleeping rough, which is the visible sign of people being homeless. But there's also the sofa surfers, people sleeping in friends' houses and other alternative forms of accommodation. It's very expensive, and of course it has a severe impact both on children and all sorts of people at all stages of their lives. So my legislation is aimed at getting prevention as being the first point of call. Because at the moment, if you approach a local authority, if you've got children under the age of 16, if you've got drug or alcohol problems, if you've got mental or physical health problems which disable you, then you'll get treated as priority homeless by a local authority. But if you're not in one of those categories, a local authority will just routinely turn people away. So my legislation that I'm glad is now on the statute books means that up to 56 days before someone becomes homeless, they'll be able to approach their local authority. The local authority will produce a plan for them, and then at the end of the plan, at the end of the actions, there should be an offer of accommodation, probably in the private sector. It may not be where people are living right now, but at least there will be a place for people to live. And I think that's the first aspect. The second aspect that we have as a solution...
Can I just ask you very quickly, I want to pick up on the sofa surfing, because lots of people aren't aware that this falls into the figures, but actually the majority of people in these figures are sofa surfing. What kind of impact does that have on people's lives?
Well, obviously it means they don't have a secure place to live, and very quickly people run out of friends or people that will accommodate them for a temporary period of time. And if they've got access to some sort of finance, then obviously they can stay in hotels or guest houses or whatever. But then once they run out of that, they go to friends. Once friends say, well, I'm very sorry, but you can no longer stay here, then often they end up sleeping rough or sleeping in cars or other forms of homelessness. And that's, of course, all invisible right now. And the reality is that what we've got to do is make sure that we build more homes for people at prices they can afford to pay.
And is there also an element that big cities are a victim of their own success? So rents are going up and up and up, and people simply can't afford to pay them.
Well, one of the reasons why rents are going up is that supply hasn't actually kept up with demand. We know for the last 30 years that realistically governments of all political persuasions should have been building 200,000 new homes, and we've come nowhere near that number. We had back in 2009 we had the lowest level of house building since the 1920s, and slowly the numbers have crept back up. We're about 165,000 units completed last year. That's still below the numbers we need. So what we've got to do is make sure we have low cost, I think, system built housing at a price that people can afford to rent, maybe to buy if that's what they choose to do, and put those in place quickly so people have somewhere to live. I mean, the cost of, just in London alone, the cost for local authorities housing priority need households is £600 million a year in temporary accommodation. That's a huge cost, that if we can actually reduce that cost, we can make sure that money is better spent on providing permanent homes for people.
And how about this idea of property guardians? Because we've seen it is used in cities like Bristol, where council properties that are derelict or empty are let out to people to look after them.
That's not a new idea. That's, as you say, it's been used in various different parts of the country at various different times. One of the problems is, obviously, you've got to have a property that is fit for habitation and is safe for people to live in. I worry if you've got electrical or gas equipment in a property, if it's not being installed and looked after by competent engineers, there's a risk to life and limb, and that's a serious concern. And I think that's one of the aspects that does need to be carefully examined before you start bringing properties in that guise back into usage. I'm far more into what I would call system-built housing that can be put up relatively cheaply. It isn't long-term housing, but it can last for 30 years, and then allowing local authorities to rent the properties on a rental that is commensurate with the cost of building the properties in the first place, which is something that is used in Germany, it's used in Holland quite a lot, and something that we could learn from and utilise here. The other aspect that we've got to look at very closely is that, the various different social landlords, the housing associations, have got large-scale reserves, and those could be utilised to build properties for the crisis that we face in terms of providing much more affordable accommodation that people could afford to rent, rather than getting into a position of ever-increasing benefits and ever-increasing rent levels. Because until we address the demand and get the supply side right, we're never going to actually cause this problem to go away.
All right, all very interesting ideas. Thank you, Bob Blackman, Conservative MP for Harrow East. Appreciate your time.
A leading charity is warning that the number of rough sleepers in England, Scotland and Wales is set to soar in the next decade. More than 9,000 people are thought to be homeless, and research conducted for Crisis suggests that government's official figures underestimate the problem. The charity highlights the growing problem of so-called sofa surfing, where people temporarily bed down at friends' houses. Seema Kateta reports now from Leicester.
It's nice when you know you've got a sofa to go to. That night you know you're going to be comfortable. It might last today, it might last tomorrow, but then that's it, I'm back out on the streets again.
Mike is a sofa surfer. He goes from one house to the next, sleeping on friends' couches to try and stay off the streets.
You get to see a little bit, because you've got your friendship with your friends. You're happy that they've looked after you for a little bit, but then you know you've got to go. Then again, you're sitting there thinking every day, right, it's a struggle. What am I going to do for the next day? What have I got to get motivated for? Who's going to help me today?
Today's report suggests more than 68,000 people across Britain are sofa surfing. It's a hidden type of homelessness because it goes on behind closed doors. Campaigners say it's on the rise and will get worse if the government doesn't act now. For those sleeping rough, their patience is wearing thin.
It's disgusting. Well, I mean, that's why people drink a lot and are on drugs. I don't blame them, because they can't live. They've got nowhere to live. It's a disgrace.
It's not difficult to find people like this here in Leicester city centre who say they have no choice but to sleep on the streets. This man says he's been homeless for years, and he believes that the main drivers for homelessness are drugs and mental health problems. Patrick used to be homeless. He now helps those who have nowhere to go.
We have new things like legal highs now, what are coming out. People who are sort of in chaos, got nowhere to turn, will take these legal highs, and it just makes homelessness a bit more harder because it's hard to engage with these people.
The government says it's investing more than £500 million into solving the problem. It says new legislation that will be implemented next year will put pressure on councils to do more to help rough sleepers.
I'm fed up of living like this, sick of it. Every day's a struggle. You know, most days I don't make enough for what I need, and that's it, I'm out here.
Seema Kateta, BBC News, Leicester.
Now, it's been described as a national scandal. Last year, there were over 9,000 people sleeping rough in Britain, and that number is expected to nearly double within the next decade. Crisis, the national charity for homeless people, warns that more than 500,000 people will be homeless by 2041 unless government policy is changed. Jane Death reports.
Derek Fraser and Kipper have lived on the streets of Bury since April when they were evicted. Derek was hit with benefit sanctions and couldn't pay the rent. Now, home is a tent.
And the tent was actually attacked, let's say, one morning, let's say at 4:40 a.m, probably by some junkie, let's say, passing through. And let's say just slashed the back of the tent, said, "What are you doing here, mate?" and then soon scarpered.
2 days a week, the charity The Red Door can help with some food, a shower, trying to sort housing. James Bateman became a rough sleeping statistic 3 weeks ago when his relationship broke down.
You feel like you're a burden when you're homeless, when you've got no money, when you've got nothing at all. You know, I actually haven't got any friends to turn to or to rely on. You know, I've been scraping by literally, I've sold everything that I ever owned so that I can carry on.
The charity Crisis says the number of people left on the street is going to explode in the next decade. Around 9,000 people slept rough last year. The analysis predicts that if government policies don't change, 16,000 could be in the same situation by 2026. That would be a 76% rise. Crisis also says that last year nearly 9,000 households were sleeping in tents or in cars or on public transport, and 12,000 households were living in squats. In Bury, they say the biggest factor is benefit caps and cuts.
Benefits is a minefield now. There is so many trapdoors. I will get on the phone to Benefits and listen to the first 6 bars of Vivaldi Four Seasons repeatedly, time and time again. It's like some kind of, I don't know, Guantanamo Bay psychological torture. And I'm a professional, I'm doing that. It's not my problem, I'm doing it on behalf of somebody else. Can you imagine if you're in crisis and you're dealing with that and you've got no money and you're on the street?
Crisis think that in about 25 years' time, 500,000 people will have nowhere to call home. And more than half of those will be here in London. On the Strand, I met Harry, killing time. He says when he left care, he wasn't classed as a priority for housing, the reason a lot of single guys end up on the street.
They fall out of their family and end up out in the streets. They can't get work, they can't get house when on the streets, so they end up staying there longer. Depression, it gets to. Nobody understands you, nobody listens to you.
And where will you be tonight?
Bushes. Hiding in the bushes in the parks. Best place to hide.
Bushes, tents, other people's sofas. Crisis says if the government could double the amount of new housing over the next 20 years, we could save many people from this lonely, frightening life. If we don't, more will find themselves moving from homes to homelessness.
Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP, Bob Blackman, who was the sponsor of the Homelessness Reduction Act, and Darren, who found himself sleeping rough last year. Bob Blackman first. I mean, these figures are absolutely shocking. I know you're very familiar with them. The stories also incredibly shocking.
Yes, one of the
Doesn't your
is,
government, the party of government, your party who's in government, bear some responsibility for what's going on?
Yes, I think the problem is that we've got a problem that's extended back 30 years, where we haven't built enough properties for the demand that there is for 30 years. And it reached a peak, actually, of a low point in 2009, with the fewest number of properties being built since the 1920s. Since then, it's recovered. We're still not at the level of house building or home building that we need to cope with the annual demand.
It's not just social housing, though, is it? I mean, you heard one of the people in the piece there talking about benefits cuts, and, you know, we've had cuts to the mental health budget. There's a whole load of issues that are coming home to roost now,
I think one of the problems here is that because the demand is exceeded the supply for so long, what happens is that landlords can raise their rents, and then, of course, they raise their rents dramatically, and so the benefits don't cover the rent. What we have to do is get the supply right, so we build more homes, and government is putting £500 million into combating rough sleeping and homelessness over the next 5 years, and equally building more homes. We're going to build 1 million more homes over the next 5 years.
OK, Darren, You had a double whammy, didn't you, of losing your job, and also then the cost of housing was a factor too, I believe, wasn't it? So tell us about that.
So I lost my job around March, April last year, and resulted in me losing the flat that I was renting, and which led to me having to live rough sleeping in a park in London.
Which must have been incredibly traumatic.
It was, and I was lucky enough to be found by St Mungo's, who arranged for me to be interviewed at one of their projects, and I was lucky enough I had a phone call the next day letting me know that I could move in, and that was a huge relief.
And this was a hostel run by the charity St Mungo's?
A hostel run by, a charity St Mungo's in London. And they've supported me so much since. I'm just eternally grateful for... I was lucky, I'm one of the lucky ones that got picked up and got found by them.
But what do you think was the main problem for you that government could address?
I think that there's a lack of funding from central government to local authorities and to charities. I think that more can be done. A lot of it comes down to money. If money could be given to local authorities or charities, people to be able to support the people that are homeless on the streets.
Well, let me put that straight back to Bob. When it comes to money, you know, this is a government of austerity, isn't it?
Well, the key point here is that prevention is the key. If people, like Darren, were helped originally, so that there was a prevention route, which is the aim of my legislation, is that 2 months before someone becomes homeless, they'll be able to approach the local authority. The local authority will have to deal with them. They'll have to provide them somewhere with an offer of somewhere to live. That's the key, because the crisis say that 27% of homelessness can be prevented by early intervention.
And one way of preventing it with early intervention would be to reverse some of those cuts to mental health funding, wouldn't it? Because a lot of people on the streets have had mental health issues. Would you back that as your next bill?
Well, my next bill, the key point is to actually get the supply. Because if you don't get the housing supply, then all that we do is we throw more and more money in benefits, and the landlords raise the rents ever more. So that doesn't actually solve the problem. It's the supply issue which is the key.
Darren, do you agree with that? That you know, Bob is putting the whole sort of burden here on increasing housing supply. Do you agree with that?
Kind of. I think early intervention that Bob mentioned is definitely key. Rather than wait until a problem gets worse, the earlier you can deal with that, the earlier it's to find a solution, because I think the number of homeless people is going to double by 2041. And it's a crazy level at the moment that we live in this first world country and there's so many homeless people out there.
But what do you think about the fact that if you look at the manifesto pledge to halve rough sleeping during the course of the Parliament, it would still then be above the level it was when the Tories came to power? What do you make of that?
Well, one of the problems is that once people are on the streets, living on the streets...
Now, what do you make of that,
the point is, it's really hard, once someone is on the streets, to get them up on their feet and back to straight and narrow, because they often have mental health problems, they have physical health problems, they also get, they're likely to be abused, they're likely to die very young. They cost the health service enormous sums of money. So what we have to do is to get those people into the housing charities, people that can really help them directly and that they will trust. This is the other issue.
Darren, what toll has your period on the streets taken on you, do you think?
It was horrible being lonely, sleeping in a park by yourself. I didn't associate with drugs or alcohol, and that's rife. That you do see. It was just such a lonely time, and to be brought into St Mungo's, and there's other charities out there as well, was such an amazing thing for me. And it took me a long time to get my confidence back. I volunteer now for full time with Outside In, which is part of St Mungo's, and I'm helping other people now on a daily basis.
And you're now so confident that you've come in the studio and told us all about it. So thank you very, very much for doing that.
Thank you.
And Bob Blackman, thank you to you too. Thank you very much.
I've been getting